Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eleanor Gamble. I've got the great pleasure of being the director of the School of Life in Sydney. And I'd like to welcome you to this very special event presented by the School of Life and Splendour in the Grass. I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of all of us present the Minyunbul people, traditional custodians of the land on which this event is taking place, and pay tribute to the unique role they play in the life of this region. On behalf of the School of Life, I offer our deep respects to elders past and present, and to First Peoples from across this country. Today we're here for a very special event for Splendour. It is a first for us at the School of Life and for Splendour because what we're going to do is have a live discussion. I will spell out how this will work in a moment, but first I'm going to give you a little bit of background. We're all aware that every day we make ethical and personal decisions. What to wear, how to get to work, what to eat, where to shop, whether to give money to someone in need. At the School of Life, we're interested in how we can make these ethical choices as individuals and as societies, and believe strongly that philosophers play a valuable role in helping us grapple with these ethical issues in the public realm. So, we invited one of the world's most renowned philosophers to guide us in an ambitious conversation of 7 subjects of what really matters. Before I invite Peter Singer to the stage, I'd like us to set a few ground rules and to explain how this will work. We have 7 subjects to discuss in a little over an hour. They're big subjects and each one could easily take all afternoon. Peter is going to talk to each subject briefly, and then he will take as many questions as possible in the allocated time. To keep us to time, we will show each subject on the screen, and each subject will have a countdown timer. When we reach the end of the timer, we'll move on to the next topic quite quickly. It's going to be fast, and we'd love to get to as much depth as we possibly can before moving on to the next subject. So this means that collectively we need to agree to a few ground rules. Firstly, this is a very safe and respectful space. Please be courteous and kind. We want to encourage debate and deep questioning, but respect for each other and our views is paramount. To ask a question, just raise your hand. One of the Splendour team will come and find you and give you a microphone. I'll be trying to get questions from as diverse a group as I can, so men, women, younger people, older people, people sitting in different areas in the room, and also those who don't immediately put their hands up to give people an opportunity to speak that may not instantly be so inclined. And to acknowledge also that we don't all have the same experience or knowledge on any of these topics. When asking a question, please be as concise as you possibly can, and if Peter needs any other information from you, he will ask you for it. If you're still holding a mic at the end of a subject and haven't had a chance to ask your question, please hand it back to one of the Splendour team afterward. So, with the ground rules in place, thank you for joining us in this ambitious conversation on what really matters with Peter Singer. Peter Singer divides his time between New York City and Melbourne. He is Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and Laureate Professor of the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. An internationally renowned philosopher and acclaimed author, Peter was named one of the world's 100 most influential people by Time magazine in 2005. Please join me in making very welcome Peter Singer.
I think this is on. Yes, it's on. Good. Hello. Thank you very much for that welcome. It's great to be here. Beautiful day in Byron, and it's good to see some of the audience that is awake after whatever you were doing last night, and not in the surf, and all the other temptations that you're resisting to hear me. I'm really flattered. So we're going to talk about what really matters. We're going to talk about a number of values, and I want to keep this moving reasonably fast, but I do want to hear you. This is not me giving a talk. I'm going to say some things, but I want to have a lot of interaction with you. So what I want to do is to essentially encourage you to think about fundamental values. Some of these things I'll talk about may be really important values to you. Others may not be. And I want you to think about why some of them are and why some of them are not. I'm also going to be drawing a distinction between intrinsic values, that is, things that are values in themselves, and instrumental values, by which I mean things that are values because they lead to other things. So, if you like, indirect values or use values, not they have to lead to something else that is itself an intrinsic value. So, money is a classic example of something that is an instrumental value, most people think, rather than an intrinsic value. It's a bit hard to say that just having a lot of money would be a good thing in itself if there was nothing at all you could ever buy for it. So keep in mind that distinction as we talk about some of these values. Okay, let's go. So I'm going to start off with well-being, and by well-being I mean whatever it is that we think about when we say somebody's life has gone really well for them. Okay, so what are the constituents of a good life, not thinking now about the impact you're having on others, that may of course be relevant, may be instrumentally valuable, but thinking about what is, you know, a good life for the person. So things that are obviously would be not good would be if their lives had a lot of pain and suffering. So pain, suffering are things that are negative to the idea of well-being. They reduce your well-being. And conversely, therefore, happiness and pleasure would be things that most people would think would be part of positive well-being. If your life is happy, that's something that contributes to your well-being. But what we need to think about is this everything that there is? Is it all that matters? The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who started the philosophical view known as hedonism, from the Greek word for pleasure, maintained that it is. But he was criticized even in ancient times. People said, this is a philosophy for swine, for pigs, right? If a pig is well-fed and wallowing in the mud and so on, in company of other pigs, they can be happy. Do we really think that what's good for us, our well-being, is simply similar to the well-being of pigs? Maybe slightly different things that we get pleasure from, but similar. And so John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century utilitarian, tried to draw a distinction between the quality of pleasures and the quantity of pleasures. He suggested that Socrates, dissatisfied, is still happier than a fool or a pig satisfied. Do we agree with that? Or is it, in fact, is this a kind of intellectual bias that you think that Socrates somehow has a higher quality of pleasure and therefore better? And the final thing that I want to say before I throw it over to you is, are we only talking about human well-being? If we think that well-being is a good, what about the well-being of non-humans? Most obviously, non-human animals seem to be capable of having a well-being. We've just been talking about pigs. So not only pigs, but dogs and cats and chickens and kangaroos, and presumably have well-beings as well. They can certainly suffer and they can enjoy their life. So is their well-being a value too? Okay, I hope I haven't used up too much of our time. Let's have some comments on this. Anyone? Yes, okay.
Just here in the center.
That distinction between the happy pig and the thoughtful person, I mean, part of the mindfulness to me is to aspire to become more of that happy pig. Like, how does that fit with what you're describing? Okay,
so you want to actually set aside the concerns that made Socrates dissatisfied and be able to take pleasure in the moment. Is that right?
That's right.
Be here now kind of thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, good. Okay, so you're agreeing really with Epicurus and with the hedonists. That really is what is important. That is the ultimate value. And the other things are distractions from that. At least, as I said, the ultimate value for ourselves, for what makes our life go well. Do we have time for... Yeah, we have time for a bit more.
Other questions? And just at the back here on the left. Thank you.
Is this a microphone? How much someone smiles and laughs as health?
Yes, you're taking that as an indication of whether they're happy or as a part of their well-being, that they're smiling and laughing?
I think it's a good sign of well-being.
Right, okay.
Because people can be physically sick but still well, I suppose.
Yes, they certainly can. They can still be enjoying life. What you've raised in a way, I suppose, is the question, how do we know when somebody is happy? And the things we observe about them that you mentioned, that they're smiling or laughing or looking contented, is certainly a part of that. It's something that people have tried to do more. Social scientists have tried to find more ways of measuring happiness and better ways of measuring happiness, because there's a move on now to say that what is really important for a society or a country is not how big its economy is, not what its gross net income or gross domestic product is, but how happy its people are. Famously, the little Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan uses gross national happiness rather than gross national product or gross national income as a way of measuring how well off the country is. But how do we assess how happy people are? There are polls, of course, there are surveys, and some of those surveys just ask people, how satisfied are you with your life? And that's one way of measuring. But it turns out that there's another way of measuring which gives you rather different results. So one of my former Princeton colleagues, Daniel Kahneman, got a lot of people to allow him to program their mobile phone so that it would go off at random intervals during the day, and when they answered it, a little chart popped up and they had to enter a number to indicate how happy they were feeling at that particular moment. So this is more, you know, what's your mood like right now? Are you enjoying yourself right now? And it turned out that that gave rather different answers to questions like how satisfied are you with your life? And one of the interesting aspects is that how satisfied are you with your life correlated pretty well with how well off the country was. So, as you might expect on that scale, countries like, I think the #1 country was Denmark, has a high quality of life. And generally, you know, other affluent nations in Europe did pretty well, Australia did pretty well, New Zealand, United States and Canada also not badly. Whereas when you ask people the mood question, a lot of other countries that were not that well off did quite well. So quite a lot of Latin American countries, Brazil did particularly well, though it's obviously not as wealthy as the countries that I just mentioned. So, you know, this in a way encourages us to think about what is really important. If people in Brazil are in a good mood, a lot of the time, enjoying themselves, does it matter that they're not as well off as people in Denmark? Presumably they're still, you know, not too badly off. The ones in extreme poverty probably not in a good mood as often. But are we looking at the wrong things in trying to build economic growth rather than trying to think of ways of basically making people happier in the moment, which goes back to what our first questioner said.
I think we have another question just here.
Yeah, it goes on from what you just said. The question is, what's your take on how modern day consumption and consumerism is manipulating the perception of what happiness is?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Part of what I said just now is relevant to that, but there are other specific things that you can think of where advertising tries to manipulate us in order to convince us that we need to buy a certain product, which we might not otherwise have thought we needed to buy, and in fact it may do so by making us feel insecure about some aspect of our life. So, you know, I'm old enough to remember a time when people did not routinely assume that they needed to buy a deodorant. That may be shocking to some of you younger people, but to me, you know, perfectly normal. People have body odors, some of them are stronger than others, so you wash if it gets bad, but the idea that you need to buy a product specifically against that is something that I think we were sold. We were sold by people who obviously have made billions of dollars out of selling us those products. If you think, well, yeah, but you know, that's gross, that is something we need, then you can probably think of another product or a range of products that we've been sold on that people think we need nowadays that maybe you yourself don't think we need.
So we probably have time for one more quick question. It's just in the centre here.
I'm interested in how you think about guilty pleasures, so pleasures for now versus over the long term, and how that affects your well-being.
Right. Hedonists, and I share this aspect of it, think that you ought to be considering the future equally with the present, except that you might discount it for uncertainty. So if you're thinking about, saving for the future, and you think you'll be able to get more enjoyment out of something if you save for the future than if you spend it right now, that's fine. But you do need to take account of the fact that we can't be certain about the future. Circumstances may change. So depending how far out the future is, the uncertainty increases. But otherwise, I think, yes, we should be thinking timelessly as far as we can. And typically, we don't do that. We don't do enough of it, but we should be doing more of it.
So the next topic is rights.
Okay, so this is a contrast with what I've been talking about. Hedonism, the idea of happiness, maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering, goes along with what is known as a utilitarian ethic. That is the idea that goes back to Jeremy Bentham, that we should try to do what will bring about the greatest net surplus of happiness over misery. Some people use the slogan, greatest happiness of the greatest number, for that idea. But that slogan's rather misleading because it suggests that if you had 51%, you would make 51% happier, that would be the right thing to do, no matter how miserable it made the 49%. And in fact, utilitarians have never said that. They've always said you have to talk about how great the loss of suffering, how great the reduction in happiness is for the 49%, and how great the increase is for the 51%. And so you could have something that in fact only harmed 1% of the population, but if it caused them to be in a terrible situation, and it caused the 99% just to be slightly better off, that would not be what a utilitarian wanted. So that's the position that I want to contrast with a rights-based view, or at least with a rights-based view in a absolutist or inviolable form. We talk about rights a lot nowadays. It's very much part of our political language, defending rights of people, oppressed groups, talking about animals, people talk about animal rights. But what do we really mean by this, and how do we ground talking about animal rights? Jeremy Bentham, who was the father of modern utilitarianism, was suspicious about the idea of rights. In particular, he lived during the period of the French Revolution, and the French revolutionaries established this document of the rights of man and citizen. And Bentham actually thought that they talked a lot about natural rights. It's also in the American Declaration of Independence that everybody, we're all born free and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Bentham thought the idea that there are natural rights is nonsense. He thought there are no rights in nature. Rights are things that are created by human societies, and in particular by laws. So in a famous remark he said, natural rights are nonsense, and natural and imprescriptible rights, that is, natural rights that you can't ever violate, is nonsense upon stilts. So he thought that it would be better to talk about establishing securities against misrule. So he thought the French revolutionaries were right to try to limit the powers of the sovereign, for example, because that would be a security against sovereigns who misruled, who oppressed and abused the people. But he didn't think that they were something in nature. He thought they were something that a sovereign body, a parliament, a French assembly could create. Let me give you an example of a rights-based approach that I think might make you uncomfortable with at least the idea that there are inviolable rights. You might remember that on September the 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda members hijacked 4 planes. And there was a point at which they had crashed 3 of those planes into buildings. 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon. And there was a 4th plane up in the air. At that point, the US Air Force had scrambled fighter pilots and was considering whether to shoot down the fourth plane. Of course, if they shot it down, all the passengers aboard it would be killed. But if they didn't shoot it down, it seemed, you know, as completely certain as you can ever be about anything, that the pilot was going to crash it into some other building. It was heading for Washington, perhaps the Capitol building, who knows, where it would kill many other people probably on the ground as well as the people in the plane. Now, in fact, what happened with that plane is the passengers tried to overpower the hijackers. They stormed the cockpit, we know from the voice recorder, but they failed to, and instead the pilot just headed the plane straight for the ground and everybody on it was killed, but it did crash in a field, so the passengers at least stopped other people being killed. Subsequent to that, a discussion arose in Germany, which has a constitution that says the rights, essentially it says the rights, human rights or human dignity is inviolable. And a discussion arose as to whether in that situation it would be right to shoot down, let's say, the fourth plane. And that went all the way, because I think the Ministry of Defense wanted a verdict, it went all the way to the German Constitutional Court. And the German Constitutional Court said, no, you cannot do that. Even in that situation, even if you're as certain as anything can be that this plane is going to be crashed, let's say it's heading for let's say the World Cup is on and there's a big football match in Germany and it's heading for a stadium packed with 80,000 people, you still can't shoot it down. So one of the questions I'm going to pose to you, not the only question I want to ask about this, is do you agree with that? Do you think that that would be violating an inviolable right of these people, the right to life, because you would be killing them? Although, of course, their life expectancy is going to be very short if you don't kill them. But still, the German court thought that would be a violation of their rights. What do you think about that?
And just a reminder that if you have a question, that's wonderful. We encourage as many as possible, but you're also very welcome to challenge Peter back. You
Please.
don't need to agree with what he's talking about necessarily, but we'd love to hear from all of you. Any questions? Just in the corner at the back there. Thank you.
All right, I want to go back to your discussion about utilitarianism. And I basically agree with what I think you're saying, but there is this important detail about exactly what we should be optimising. And you mentioned the misunderstanding over, benefiting the 51% with catastrophic results for the 49%. But then that begs the question, well, what should the optimisation function be, particularly given what you said about Kahneman's and others' work, about how a person's subjective experience of how happy they are is actually quite different from the external situation. What exactly should we be optimising?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think the classic utilitarian answer is we should be optimising pleasure and happiness and the minimising pain and suffering. And I think that that view is actually closer to what Kahneman was measuring, that is the mood that people are in, how people are feeling now and now and now and now and all the other moments of the future that they have, more than are they satisfied with their life. One of the objections I didn't go into is but with taking are you satisfied with your life as a measure is that you may in fact be satisfied because you have very low expectations. You may be in a minority group that is subordinate in that society, and you may have just accepted, you may have acquiesced. Oh yes, we, my ethnic minority, or it could be women in some societies, of course, just, cannot have the expectations to do the things that the majority ethnic group or men are doing. And so they may say, I'm satisfied with my life in that sense. I'm satisfied given my low expectations. So I think the mood idea is a better one. But it's true that we don't really have very good ways of measuring it. Kahneman has shown us one way, but how really, if you want to get technical, what he's shown is an ordinal scale. It doesn't show that when people say, I'm at 8, that they're twice as happy as at 4. And therefore you could say, oh, well, here we've got 10 people at 4, and that's as good as 5 people at 8. So we're not quite ready, really, you know, and I'm not sure how we can be, but we have to think more about it to work out exactly what we want to measure. But I hope what I've said gives you some idea of it.
Any other questions for Peter on rights? Just at the back, far left. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a kind of practical concern. So with the kind of utilitarianist argument against this rights-based argument, I think that if we kind of took the utilitarianist idea and tried to maximize most good for most people, and coming back to the 9/11 example, that puts a lot of stress on the individual to determine, like...
Sorry, puts a lot of stress on what?
The individual to determine, like, what is good. Like
right.
Practically, can we really accept that, like, as a mainstream way of making ethical decisions? Whereas the rights-based argument kind of comes and has, like, a level playing field that everyone can kind of abide by. Surely that's, in the long term, going to be good, because people often make mistakes.
Right, so what you're contrasting, I think, here is, on the one hand, the need to make a decision where you don't have any real rules or guidelines, with the idea that if we have certain rules and guidelines, and they might include saying all human beings have certain rights that you must never violate, then it's easier to make those decisions. You know what the rules are. And in fact, there's a lot of other moral rules too, not specific to rights, that we might use. So we might tell people, you know, never tell a lie. And that's a simple rule, and you can know if you're honest with yourself when you're telling a lie and when you're not, and if you follow that rule, that's easy. But, and I'll come to this later on, do we really want people just to decide on the basis of those rather simple kinds of rules? Because clearly we can think of some cases where we think they'll go wrong. So what you're pointing to, I think, is the idea that it's useful to have some ideas of rules, and perhaps they can be based on certain ideas of rights that we should respect. But while that is useful in terms of educating people and giving people general guidance, I think there's still a real question as to whether we want people to follow those in all circumstances, and if so, how we can distinguish the cases where we don't want them to follow the rules from those where we do.
I think we might move on to the next topic now, which is justice.
Right. So this is one of the other things that is often contrasted with utilitarian ideas, principles of justice. If we go right back to the beginning of Western philosophy, perhaps one of the classic text, which we might see as a founding text of Western philosophy, was Plato's Republic. And in Plato's Republic, a character whom Plato calls Socrates, and historians discuss whether this is really supposed to be a portrait of the real Socrates, who was more or less Plato's contemporary, or not. But anyway, this character called Socrates walks around Athens talking to people and asking them, what is justice? Socrates' idea is, what I know that other people don't know is that I know nothing. Other people think that they know lots of things, but they don't, and I want to find out from them what they think they know. So various people would give him various accounts of what justice is, and then he would think of counterexamples. So, for example, one of the characters in the Republic says, justice is giving people what you owe them. And Socrates says, well, suppose that you've borrowed a knife from your friend, and your friend in the meantime has gone crazy. But still, you've borrowed the knife, it's his knife, you owe him a knife. Should you return this knife to him when in his crazy mood he might use it to harm himself or others? And Plato's assumption was that the answer is no, so justice must be something else. And Plato spends quite a lot of time giving an account of what justice is. And again, as I said, this is something that is often contrasted with utility, with producing the most good, and therefore used as, again, as a counterexample to the idea that we should act as utilitarians suggest. When I started doing a philosophy course at the University of Melbourne, I had a teacher called McCloskey, H.J. McCloskey, who was an anti-utilitarian. And he invented, as far as I know, at least I don't know any earlier uses of it, an example which he used to argue against utilitarianism. this was in the 60s, and so the era in which white Americans would use lynch mob justice against African Americans was still pretty fresh, perhaps not even completely in the past. So McClosky's example is based on that. He says, so imagine that you're the sheriff in a southern town, and a white woman has been raped, and she says she was raped by an African American. She wouldn't have used that term, of course, in the 50s, but she says, yes, it was one of those black people. But she can't identify who it was. So a mob of white Southerners rounds up 6 young black men, takes them to a tree where people have been lynched in the past with plenty of rope, and says, we're going to lynch all 6 of them as a lesson. Now, you're the sheriff, but physically you're just not able to stop them doing that. You could not overpower them. They have gun. You have a gun, but they have guns too. This is the South after all. So you cannot really stop them if they go ahead with this. But there is one thing that you could do. You could say, no, don't lynch them all. I've got evidence that that's the one who did it. And you point to one of these 6 blacks who is about to be lynched. And let's say that they would believe you. They would then lynch that person, and the other 5 would go. So you would have saved 5 lives. But McCloskey says you would have acted unjustly. You would have unjustly accused a person who is probably innocent of a crime. And particularly as an officer of the law, that is something you should never do. So that's another example, as with the example of rights, where, yes, we might say it would be unjust for you to do that, but it's a separate question as to whether it would be right for you to do that. Again, given that all 6 will be lynched if you don't do exactly that, because you can't think of anything else that would stop them.
Does anyone have any comments? Just at the front here is the first one. And anyone else who has a question, if you could raise your hand now so we can get some mics to you, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. My question speaks to, I guess, philanthropy, not just as a way to distribute funds or money, but also to respond to injustice. And I wonder, at what point does donating to a cause, it's actually you being able to say, well, this is unjust and therefore I'm responding to that, more than just here's my money or here's my allocated funds for doing good. So
yeah,
thank you.
Very good question, and one that, because I'm involved in philanthropy, in movement that's known as effective altruism, that I am really interested in. And let's bring it down to home and give it an example. Many of us feel, you gave the welcome to country here when we began, and many of us feel strongly that we Europeans have been unjust towards the indigenous inhabitants of this country, and that we have an unresolved problem with that injustice. And I think that that's probably true. But if you are considering philanthropic causes, does that mean that you should regard helping Indigenous Australians as a priority? Because you, as an Australian, maybe you don't have ancestors that go back to the times when terrible things were being done in the earlier days, or the worst things were being done, but you may feel, still, I'm benefiting from the injustice that was done by Europeans earlier. So I should be putting my philanthropy into helping Indigenous Australians. Yet it's also true, I think, that because Australia is a reasonably wealthy nation, because the government is to some extent aware of this problem, is putting some resources into it, because Indigenous Australians are entitled to social security and healthcare as other Australians are, there are other people in the world who are significantly worse off than Indigenous Australians, significantly poorer, and for whom, for example, let's just talk in monetary terms, not necessary to give money, but let's say for whom a donation of $1,000 might make a huge difference to their life. That can easily be more than they earn in an entire year. It can give them the opportunity, for example, to educate their children, or maybe they can get some health care for a sick child who would otherwise die because they're not entitled to free health care. Whereas my guess is that $1,000 donated to Indigenous Australian causes, so it would do some good, would not do as much good as it would do in those circumstances. So you're balancing again, doing the most good you can, which happens to be the title of a book I wrote, The Most Good You Can Do, as against trying to redress an injustice. And that's a longish answer to your question, but in the end, I'm going to doing more good in this particular case, leaning towards that more than I am towards redressing the injustice.
We have another question in the centre. Thank you.
I'm curious about what you think, how...
Sorry, I'm not hearing you. Can you hold the mic a bit closer?
Sorry. I was curious about to what extent you think the practical constraints on the administration of justice should affect how we conceive of justice proper, and what role that would have for how justice operates in our society.
Yes. Well, it's another good question. Obviously, we do have practical constraints. For example, clearly we don't want to convict anyone who's innocent of a crime. And yet, we know that that does happen. It's possible that we could build in more and more safeguards, have a more elaborate trial system that would, if not eliminate, at least make that less likely. But it would also mean that fewer criminals were convicted, properly convicted, of crimes that they have committed. So that's one example, and there are many other examples where, in terms of costs, we can't always act as justly as we would like to. So I think that that has to be a trade-off. It's not a perfect world. We can't spend everything we have on making sure that we are as just as we possibly can be. There's always going to be some rough edges on that, and that's unfortunate. But I don't see any way around it if we are to use the revenues that governments raise for a variety of good purposes, not all of which are directed towards perfect justice. I just don't think we're in a world where perfect justice is possible.
So we'll move on to the next topic now. And just a reminder for those who have recently joined us that this is very much a live discussion, and we encourage lots of questions to Peter throughout. Next topic is knowledge.
Okay, so we all think of knowledge as a good thing. At least I think we generally think of knowledge as a good thing. But what I want to raise here, most basic question perhaps, is knowledge intrinsically good, or is knowledge an instrumental good? Is it something that we value because of the things that we can get through it? So, for example, we value expanding our scientific knowledge, medical, biological knowledge, because that will help us to reduce diseases, reduce the burden of disease, perhaps eliminate disease, live healthier and longer lives. And that will then in turn conduce to our greater happiness and well-being, to go back to the very first value. Or do we think that knowledge is actually something that's intrinsically good, that we would rather know than be happy? So let me give you a pretty humdrum sort of example that you've probably all experienced. Some relative of yours gives you a birthday present, an article of clothing, let's say. That is not at all to your taste. And when you open it, you sort of inwardly groan and think, what am I going to do with this? But this is a relative who's, tried, well-intentioned, tried to find something that you would like, thought about you on your birthday. What do you say? Do you say, oh, thanks, but this is not really something I'd ever wear? Or do you say, oh, that's lovely, thank you so much? Obviously, if you say thanks, but this is not something I'd ever wear, you're increasing the knowledge of the person who gave it to you. But very plausibly, you're also making them somewhat unhappy because their present is not something that you would like. How do we think about that situation? Then another question about knowledge is knowledge important only if people are aware of it, only if people know it, or is knowledge a good thing in itself? So let's say we have computers that are working out lots of things that we would not otherwise be able to calculate. is that increasing knowledge? And is that a value? We now live in a world in which there's more knowledge. Or is it only if people read the results of this and either think I can use that for some good purpose, or else perhaps think, okay, that's great, you know, I've discovered a beautiful, elegant solution to a mathematical problem, and I really enjoy understanding that solution, just as other people might enjoy seeing works of art. Does the knowledge have to be part of our consciousness, someone's consciousness, in order to be of value?
So I have a first question on the side here, thank you.
I have a question about the ethics of how some knowledge is gained and what we should do with that. So back in Nazi Germany, there were a lot of experiments done on prisoners in concentration camps, very unethical, but a lot of, you know, medical discoveries and things came from that. And so should we be allowed to use that to better our lives now, or because of the unethical way in which this knowledge was gathered, should we be putting that aside and saying, no, we're not going to touch that, we're not going to use it, it's bad, it's wrong?
Right. It's an interesting example. I'd take issue with the idea that a lot of important medical discoveries have come out of that research, because some I think. And I'll give you one example that was considered valuable in a moment. But of course a lot of it was to prove racist Nazi theories about how Aryans were superior to Jews and Gypsies and so on. So a lot of it was no use at all. But one example where it was thought that the knowledge was useful, would be useful, was that the Nazis wanted to know how long a member of their military, let's say a fighter pilot or something like that, could survive in extreme cold conditions, for instance, if they crashed into the North Sea, and whether there were things that could prolong their survival. So to do that, they essentially froze a lot of concentration camp inmates, Jews, and others to death in order to do that kind of research. Now, the United States military also wanted to know that kind of information, and they were aware that the Nazis had conducted this research, and they were interested in using the results. But the fact that it became known that they were interested in using their results, and that caused an immense outcry. And so the US Air Force, I think it was the Air Force, but anyway, whichever branch of the military it was, might have been the Navy, I suppose, decided that it couldn't use those Nazi results. So what did it do? It got a whole lot of chimpanzees, and it repeated the experiments on chimpanzees. Now, I think that's clearly the wrong thing to do, right? Either you say, we're not going to use this research, and therefore we just can't learn this, except unless, you know, we observe what happens to people in varying circumstances who do get into freezing conditions, what's known as a natural experiment, something that happens anyway. And that's not always, doesn't always give you the most useful information, because you can't change the variables. Or you say, okay, well, you know, it was deeply wrong to do this research, but given that the research has been done, it doesn't do the victims of the research any good to say we're not going to use it. And I think at least in that particular situation, that would have been a defensible thing to do. The past is past, you can't undo it, and if the research could save lives and it can't be ethically performed, I think you use those results.
Next question just at the front here, thank you.
Hi, this is just in regards to when you said whether knowledge is intrinsic or instrumental. And I think that, personally, I think that just kind of depends on how you define knowledge, because if you say that knowledge is just kind of like a set of directions, like, for example, a spider has the knowledge on how to build a web, but that's not very related to how we define, like a spider can't say it's wrong to kill something like a human can. So therefore, if you're saying that knowledge is intrinsically human, then I can't really see an argument against not pursuing it, if that kind of makes sense at all.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether I've got your point. So the spider, I think, is, you know, I'm not clear that the spider actually has knowledge. The spider maybe simply has an innate program to build webs. Because if you know, perhaps happened to you, you have a spider that is building a certain web in a place where you just have to walk, and so every day you break the web, and every day the spider builds the web again, and every day it breaks again, and you think, why doesn't the spider learn to build it somewhere else? And in fact, that is a distinctive thing of spiders, that they don't seem to learn. So I would say that's not knowledge. But on the other hand, I do think some non-human animals have knowledge. Some non-human animals clearly do learn how to do things in ways that bring them the rewards. And so that, I think, is knowledge that's part of consciousness. So I don't think that knowledge is limited to human beings. But I do think it has to be something that enters someone's consciousness. And so then there's the question whether that is of value in itself, that knowledge. Now, you talked about knowing whether something is right or not. And you said the spider clearly doesn't know that, and I agree with that. But I wouldn't say, if knowledge has value, I wouldn't say it's only that kind of reflective moral knowledge. I think if you do think knowledge has value, it could be all kinds of values. So, again, many people think this is sort of something that riffs off the example of the relative who gave you the present, but makes things a bit more complicated. Think of somebody whose life seems to be going well as far as they can see. That is, they think they're successful, they think their friends respect them and love them and care for them. They think the work that they do is highly valued by others. But in fact, they're deceived. In fact, behind their back, people snigger at the work that they do and think, it's ridiculous, but, it's all a big joke, it's all a big game. Let's keep this guy thinking that he's really doing good work. And let's suppose that that game actually continues until he dies. So he never learns that behind his back people were laughing at what he was doing. He thinks that he was respected. Now, do we think that person's life went well? From a purely subjective perspective, yes, it went well. He was happy. But he clearly didn't know very much about the world immediately around him and the attitude that people had to him. So many other people would think, I wouldn't want to be like that. I'd rather be miserable than be deceived in that way. And I think that's another way of thinking. If you think I'd rather be miserable than be deceived in that way, then you do think, it appears, that knowledge is intrinsically part of what it is to live a good life, or a life of high well-being. If you don't think that, you might think that knowledge is not intrinsically valuable. We need to move on, right?
So I think we'll move on to the next topic now. And the next topic is freedom. And while Peter is having a sip of water, just a reminder to those who have just joined us, please feel very welcome to offer questions, comments, challenges back to Peter on each of these 7 topics, which we are ambitiously working through over this hour-and-a-half session with Peter Singer.
Good. All right. So freedom is something else that we often hear about as a really important value. And we often think that we would not like to live in a country where we could not be free or where we were not free. As I spend part of each year in the United States, of course, freedom is, perhaps you would say, the first value of American politics, or at least the first, held up as the first value. It may not really be, but it's the first thing that people talk about. Still see bumper stickers saying, live free or die. So, again, is freedom something that we value intrinsically, and what would we trade for freedom if, in fact, we could achieve other goods? So we might have, as a contrast here, we might take India and China, the 2 largest nations in the world in terms of population. India is a democracy, and I think most people would say that Indians are free in a way that people in China are not, because China is not a democracy, and one-party rule. There is censorship of the internet and many other restrictions on what people can do. So, and yet, on the other hand, and I'm not saying that this is entirely because of freedom, but on the other hand, in India, about 20% of the population are still below the World Bank's extreme poverty line. That is, they're living on something like $2 a day or less. Whereas in China, the development in recent years has reduced the number of people in extreme poverty, which used to be very high, used to be hundreds of millions of Chinese, have reduced it to something like 2% of the population. So 1/10 of what it is in India. Just imagine, as I say, I'm not really suggesting that it was freedom and the lack of freedom in China that caused this difference, but just think of two countries in which, if that were the case, would we think that living in freedom is worth it for the fact that we have millions of people, say 200 million people, 20% of the population of India is around 200 million people, living in extreme poverty, free but in extreme poverty, whereas in the other country they're not? Is that something that we should think, well, maybe freedom is a value, but if it comes at a cost as high as that, we don't really want it? Or should we think that it's something that we want to hang on to no matter what? And then a further question we can ask about freedom, of course, is also, how do we understand freedom? How do we define freedom? Are we thinking of the political freedoms, which is what I mentioned in terms of contrasting a democracy with a one-party state? Or are there freedoms which come with having some basic economic minimum? Do we want to say perhaps that the 200 million people in India living in extreme poverty are not free, even though they can vote, even though they're not subject to censorship, but they're not free because they simply can't afford to do many of the things that we regard as essential to living a decent kind of life?
So open up to questions. The first one in the front row. Thank you.
I was just wondering, do you think that freedom is subjective?
Tell me what you mean by subjective first, and I'll try and answer.
Okay, so an example that I'm just thinking of, I travelled to Russia, which is a place that a lot of people, I guess, would perceive to be politically totalitarian. And I met somebody there who, after finding out that I was from the West, told me that Russia is the last country on earth where one can experience true freedom. And that is something that's kind of sat with me.
Did they explain why they thought that? What do they have that the other countries don't have?
I think for him, his concept of freedom was free passage through such a large, expansive place where he perceived, I guess, everything to be quite cheap and available to most people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think what you've shown is that there are different concepts of freedom that people may have, different things that they may emphasize in terms of their freedom. But I don't think that it is subjective. I wouldn't go that far. And you said Russia, people would think of Russia as a totalitarian state. I think that's too strong. It was a totalitarian state under Stalin, for example, where you had to watch what you said to your neighbor because your neighbor might report you and you might be picked up by the KGB and so on. I don't think Russia functions like that today, but certainly if you wish to organize political opposition to Putin, and if you show any signs of being successful in organizing that political opposition, then you do face personal danger. You could be killed or you could be arrested and framed on charges that are not sound. So I think it's certainly a less free country than Australia, take as an example. But I think really the person you were speaking to was mistaken, although I don't think it's subjective, in other words, to emphasize the kinds of things that he was emphasizing to the extent that would be involved in saying it's the last country where you can be free, because it doesn't. It emphasizes some things, de-emphasizes others, which I think are an important part of freedom. So the idea of being able to organize political opposition, if you wish to do so, is, I think, a really important part of freedom.
Any other questions for Peter on freedom? It's just to the side here. Thank you.
Hi, my question's on internet freedom and the fact that governments are using possible terrorism as a way to control the way that we're sharing information and tracking what we're doing. And so just questions around what freedom means with an open platform that is so Yeah, it does need regulation, but what's your kind of definition on how much freedom we should be able to have on the internet?
Yes. So I think if we're focusing on freedom, some of the concerns that people have about the internet are not really concerns about freedom, or not intrinsic concerns about freedom. So there's a lot of concern, for example, about governments reading our emails, tracking our phone calls, the kind of thing that Snowden revealed in the United States. And not just governments, but also, of course, Google. If you let Google and you use Google, develops a lot of information about you, which it uses to target ads that are more likely to be successful in selling you products. Now, is that a lack of freedom? I don't think it is. I think you could see it as a lack of privacy, but I think privacy is a different value from freedom. I think that if the government were to use the information it gathered in order to prevent you doing things, then the government would be restricting your freedom. And even if not the government officially, but somebody else got access to this information. So this is, one case where I was told about in the United States when I was talking to someone who works with national security. And I said, have there been abuses where, with all this information, this was when Snowden was revealing what the government had been doing. I said, do you know if there have been abuses? Has the government been using this to harm people who are clearly not terrorists or security risks? And he said, to his knowledge, no. But he did know of a case where an employee had used this information, got access to his girlfriend's phone calls, and was checking up on who she was calling. Now, that's clearly an abuse. And if he then used it to say to his girlfriend something about who she was calling and she shouldn't be calling this person and whatever, then yes, maybe that restricts her freedom, and wrongly so. But I think it's only when it gets to that point. I think governments collecting information, or corporations, Google collecting information, if you want to object to that, it's not restricting your freedom until they abuse it in some way. Otherwise, what it's doing is violating your privacy. And then you have to think, how important is my privacy? Do I want Google to know where I am, because then I will get quicker answers to when I ask it for directions, or what the weather's like, or where the good restaurants are? Do I want Google to know that, or don't I? I think that's a perfectly reasonable choice to have. And if you want those quicker answers and you don't care that much whether Google knows where you are, fine. I don't think there's really a value that's being violated.
So I think we might move on to the next topic now. We've just got a few more left. The next topic is going to be nature, and feel welcome to keep the questions coming.
Yes, thank you. And I thought this was one that might be particularly good for a Byron audience. I don't know how many of you are actually from around this area, but there is so much beautiful nature around that we can see here, and there have been a lot of efforts, and I know some people in this audience who've been involved in efforts to protect and preserve nature around us. And personally, I applaud those efforts, and I think it's terrific that there is in northern New South Wales, there are a number of national parks which protect nature. And of course, there's many reasons why we might think that that is so. But is it just because nature in itself is a good thing? We very often hear appeals to nature. We hear something being said to be natural. A lot of advertisements of products say that they're natural, as if this is a good thing. John Stuart Mill, the 19th century utilitarian philosopher who I mentioned earlier, wrote an essay called On Nature, in which he began by saying that the words nature and natural are the source of the greatest amount of false taste and misleading ethical judgments, and used various other phrases that I don't totally remember, more than any other terminology. He thought that they were very much misused terms. And I tend to think that that's still true. In many ways, people think that if something is unnatural, it's bad or wrong. And that was used, when I started out being in bioethics, I was at Monash University Melbourne at the time when in vitro fertilisation was a new technique, a controversial technique, and those who opposed it sometimes say it's unnatural. It's unnatural to conceive a human being except through sexual intercourse. And that was the only way in which human beings had ever been conceived until 1978. But did that mean that it was wrong to conceive human beings through in vitro fertilisation to help women who could, or couples who could not otherwise conceive a child, to conceive a child? I don't think so. I think that was a misuse of the term natural. And I think we ought to remember that kind of misuse, because we'll come across it from time to time, and reject arguments that the fact that something is unnatural means that it's bad. The other question that I want to raise here, which is a somewhat different question, more in line with what I was saying about the nature all around us, is do we want to preserve nature? Again, do we want to preserve it for its own sake, or do we want to preserve it either because we like it, and I'm one of those people. As I said, I welcome the fact that there's a great system of national parks in New South Wales and elsewhere in Australia, and I enjoy that because bushwalking is one of my favourite recreations. I love going for walks in it. It's terrific to be in nature. I enjoy seeing it. I enjoy seeing all the diversity. It's relaxing. It's getting outdoors, away from pollution and noise and so on. So that's terrific. But, and it's also, I should say, it's also terrific for the various animals who live there. And if we didn't protect those national parks, then many of them would no doubt have been killed, or the forest would have been felled for timber, and there would be no habitat for them. But those are instrumental justifications. Those are saying national parks are good because we, and presumably future generations of human beings, enjoy using them and get a lot out of them. And they're good because non-human animals also survive in them. But is it good in itself to have biodiversity? We often think of biodiversity as a value. It's a term that conservationists often appeal to. Imagine that we have an endangered plant. Let's say it's not a spectacular tree or a flowering bush that you would even notice. It's a rather small, inconspicuous plant, but botanists tell us that it's very rare. It only exists in a certain place, and if you build something in this place, you will destroy it. But, as I say, most of us would not even notice it. It's not that if you destroy it, somehow the rest of the chain of being will fall apart. It's not what's sometimes called a keystone species. It doesn't play that role because it is rare anyway, and lots of other parts of similar ecosystems don't have it. So suppose that there was some significant purpose as to why we might want to build something in that area. Let's say we could create a lot of hydroelectricity, which would help us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, replace burning of fossil fuels, and help to avert the perils of climate change. But although this area is not particularly distinguished in other ways, you do have to go into it and risk destroying this rare plant, maybe causing the whole species of this plant to become extinct. Is that a bad thing? If so, why exactly is it a bad thing?
So open to questions. Anyone has a question, to just raise your hand. The first one just at the second row here on the right. Thank you.
I have the long-term goal of going into environmental conservation at some point. At university, I've got a lot of friends who are activists and go out and climb coal trains and things like that to prevent these companies from doing what they do and get the message out and all that stuff. I've never personally gotten involved in it, and I very much admire what they do and would like to, but oftentimes it's during university semester and I don't end up going because I'm concentrating on my studies, and I justify that with the whole thing of, you know, in the future my environmental conservation work hopefully will do greater good than me sitting on top of a coal train. I guess, what are your thoughts on the ethics of that, and how is that hypocritical?
I don't think it's necessarily hypocritical to say, although I support your protest, I'm not going to take the time to go out and join you now because I'm studying for exams and or I'm writing papers for my course, and if I do well in my course, I'll be a more effective voice for the very cause that you're protesting for. I don't think that's hypocritical. I think what it does, though, is it gives you a lot to live up to, right? Because here's all these protests where you could have contributed, you could have helped them, and you didn't for this reason. If you're genuine, then you really do have to use that time to study and work well, and when you do get your qualification, you have to sort of pay off the debt that you've built up, if you like, by being a more effective voice. But I do think it's true that people who have qualifications in relevant areas are more effective and are more likely to have influence. So I certainly don't want to discourage you or others from studying things in those areas of conservation and ecology. You know, if you're talking about climate change, as the coal protests were, then atmospheric sciences are also very important, but a whole range of different things. I don't want to discourage people from studying those things and from doing well enough in them to then go out in the world and use your qualifications to achieve the values that you want to.
Any other questions on nature for Peter? Just in the back in the light blue shirt. Thank you.
Just at the end, you asked a question and why that would be inherently a bad thing if there was a plant to die that wasn't a keystone species. I suppose, like, I wanted to try to answer it because I thought it was an interesting question, but I suppose there's mycelium in that which could exist just with that plant, and there's also the potential genetic diversity within the plant in the future that we would lose the capacity for something else to happen, if that makes sense.
So you mean the species might evolve and develop in a way that would be more significant than it is now? Is this?
Precisely, yeah.
Yes. I suppose that's true. We are sort of closing off an avenue of a distinctive genetic line, which will then not evolve any further. It's perhaps, it's fairly thin to say that it's likely that something really distinctive and different and important in some way will emerge from it. Because, I mean, it might, but it might take a very long time. Evolution works very slowly in these respects. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is something that we might want to give consideration to. It's a little bit like saying that to destroy something that has evolved over millions of years and is, as you point out, still evolving, is kind of almost like an act of vandalism. It's almost like just going into a great museum and taking a hammer to some of the works of art there, as indeed, of course, happened sadly in Syria and Iraq under ISIS. So in some ways it's a little bit like that. It's something that is part of our heritage, in the case of works of art, only for a relatively short time in evolutionary terms, but still something that we would like to pass on to innumerable future generations. And so the different species that have evolved on our planet, you could see us as being trustees for in the same way that we ought to try and pass on, because if they're gone, they are gone forever. So I do think that what you're hinting at is getting towards a plausible kind of answer to that question.
So going to move on to the next topic now.
Okay, and this is in fact the last one.
Slightly meaty one.
Right, this is the last topic, and what I'm talking about here is what is sometimes referred to as existential risk, the risk of the extinction of our species, or more broadly, of intelligent life on Earth. It's something that I mentioned before, that I've been involved in the effective altruism movement. Probably most of the people in the effective altruism movement are concerned about things like global poverty. How can we help people in extreme poverty? How can we reduce extreme poverty in the world? Some of them are concerned about the suffering of non-human animals. How can we stop factory farming and the immense amount of suffering that it inflicts on billions of non-human animals? And a few of them are concerned about how can we reduce the risk of the extinction of our species. Now you might say, well, why are they particularly concerned about that? Aren't these risks very small? And they would reply, well, yes, each individual risk is quite small, but nevertheless, that would mean the extinction of our species, and that would mean there would be no future generations ever. And that's, they think of as very important. So I'm going to ask you a question to help you see whether you think of it as very important. And this question comes from a great philosopher who was also a friend of mine called Derek Parfit. Sadly died the very beginning of this year. And he wrote a book called Reasons and Persons, in which he raises the following question. You have to listen to it all the way through to see what the question is. So he asks you to imagine 3 possible scenarios, 3 possible things that happen to our planet, to this world. Scenario A is that there are no more wars. People live peacefully and basically forever. So no large wars, you know, there may be local violence, things may go on, but just imagine things go on as they do with no more wars, and we continue to live like that. Scenario B is that there is a big nuclear war that kills 99% of the population of the planet. Only 1% survives in scenario B. Scenario C is like scenario B, except that the nuclear war kills everyone. There are no survivors, no human survivors. Maybe there are cockroaches, but there's no, they're supposed to be resistant to radiation. But there are no human survivors. Now, I'm not going to ask you which of these scenarios you think is the best. That's pretty obvious. But what I want to ask you is, think about the difference between A and B and between B and C, right? So think about the difference between no more wars, peace on Earth forever, and a big nuclear war that kills 99% of the world, and the difference between the nuclear war that kills 99% and the nuclear war that kills 100%. Which is the bigger difference? In other words, if you consider, you know, these pairs of alternatives, which is the one that you think, oh, I feel much more strongly that I want A rather than B than that I want B rather than C, or the other way around. Okay? You clear on what the question is? Good? All right, so if you think that the difference between A and B is bigger than the difference between B and C, put up your hand. Okay? If you think that the difference between B and C is bigger than the difference between A and B, put up your hand. I think there's a majority for this view. How many of you did not put up your hand at all? How many of you just can't decide or abstained or whatever? Small number. Okay, so I think there is clearly a majority. Now, I'll give you Parfit's answer. Parfit's answer is actually what most of you showed. He thinks the difference between B and C is bigger. In fact, he says he thinks it's much bigger. Why? Well, the difference between A and B is really, in the present state of the world, what is it, 99%, 7.2 billion people get killed, let's say, and the other 1% survives, or 7.4 billion, whatever the latest figure is that we're at. And that's, of course, very bad that 7.4 billion die, but 1% does survive. We can reasonably hope that they might have learnt from their experience, that they will reproduce, that give it another few thousand years, and there will again be, anyway, hundreds of millions or a couple of billion people at least living on this planet, and they may go on living for a very long time. Perhaps they may go on living for hundreds of millions of years, even billions of years. They may colonize other planets, they may learn to colonize other planets, so a nuclear war on this planet would no longer cause the extinction of our species, and you know, intelligent life would continue somewhere in this corner of the universe. And Parfit's argument is that that's vastly more than 7.4 billion lives. That's untold billions, trillions, quadrillions, quintillions of lives that would exist down all of these years, and perhaps in a whole number of different planets. So that's why he thinks that there's vastly more difference he thinks we should focus on the total number of lives affected, including the lives that would not have existed at all if our species had become extinct. So this is the question that I'm raising here. Do we think that we should be concerned also about people who do not exist and will not exist if certain things happen? Another way of thinking about this perhaps is, imagine that you're a young couple considering whether to have a child, and you talk with your partner about it, and you see both pluses and minuses. You say, oh yeah, in many ways it'd be fun to have a child, but you know, this would have an impact on our career and our freedom to do other things, what we might do. So, just as far as we're concerned, let's say, it's pretty difficult to decide. Sort of the scales are more or less balanced. But then someone comes and says to you, but what about your child? You're living in a pretty fortunate country, Australia, you're good people, you're smart people, you can probably, very good chance of bringing up a child well, your child having a really good life. And so if the scales are reasonably even, you should have that child, because there'll be another child who will eventually thank you for having been brought into existence and will have a good life, and if you don't, there won't be. So that's another way of thinking about a pretty similar question. Should we be concerned about the lives of people who might not ever exist if we decide in a certain way? Okay, let me have some quick views on that. We have a little bit of time still. Okay. I'd like to hear your views.
Questions for Peter?
Or comments. Doesn't have to be a question. Just tell me what you think about it.
I'm just curious there. Oh, sorry. Just curious there. You said the difference between A and B was bigger than the difference between... Sorry, B and C was bigger than A and B. But isn't that based on the premise that in scenario A we're still going to screw things up?
In scenario A, we're still going to screw things up. Well, I said there'll be no more wars. There might be various other things that are not so good, but no, we're not going to screw things up in the sense of ceasing to exist. And, you know, you can fill it in as you wish. Maybe with improving technology, we'll be able to eliminate poverty, and, you know, healthcare will continue to improve. So I wasn't assuming that we were going to screw things up. I was assuming that, in fact, we would continue to make progress without the shadow of terrible wars hanging over us.
But doesn't that mean then you've got another 7 or so billion that you've lost in scenario B compared to scenario A?
There's 7 billion people who've been killed in scenario B. That's definitely true, yes.
It just seems to me that A to B is still bigger than B to C, because in B to C, you're not missing that 7 billion.
But but if you take into account future possible people, you're missing a lot more than 7 billion, right? You're missing, as I said, trillions or quintillions who will never exist.
I'm a bit confused, because I thought the 7 billion that you lose in scenario B would also have lives in scenario A if you didn't kill them off. So
they would.
Right, so isn't that make A to B the larger amount of people?
But it's only 7 billion, rather than the untold quintillion, which is the difference between B and C.
Right, so A assumes a stable population.
Yeah, A assumes that people will continue to exist. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question in the centre in the black t-shirt.
Thanks. I think it speaks to our optimism of where we are in terms of the great filter, whether we're beyond or it's to come. If the nuclear war, that's the end of all of intelligent life, and we think, oh, well, that's ahead of us, maybe cells will come again and make intelligent life, or whether we think it's behind us. And we've got a chance, even if it's just this stumbling block, but the 1% can rebuild, and looking at it in a timeless point of view.
Yes, I suppose at least it would say there's a chance that they can rebuild. You're right, that we couldn't be certain that they would, but at least there's that 1% there. There is a reasonable prospect that they will, as I said, learn from those mistakes, and will be able to go forth and multiply, as the Bible says, and replenish the earth, and produce a better life. And it does depend on a certain optimism about the human condition and about our ability to learn from mistakes, and the idea that life as a whole is good, contains more happiness than suffering, and will continue to do so. I think that is an assumption that I was making, and that Parfit was making too.
Peter, if I may jump in with a question, I'd love to hear you comment on the increasing development of artificial intelligence. These are the 7 topics that you have chosen as what really matter to us, yet the race toward AI and superintelligence is, of course, a very real thing in our current way of thinking, in our current research around the world. How do you feel about our obligation now to safeguard a natural, in quotation, human intelligence before that gets too out of our control?
Yes, well, one of the, I said, you know, that many effective altruists are worried about the risk of human extinction. And one of the reasons why they're worried about this is that some of them think that creating artificial intelligence that's smarter than us is likely to happen sometime in the next, let's say, 50 or 60 years, and that that's not a wise thing to do. As one of them says, it's a basic Darwinian error to create a being who's smarter than you are. So the thought is that we may create artificial intelligence which may be smarter than us and decide that we're a problem, that we're a threat to itself, or maybe to, you know, the future of the planet. Someone who was saying, we have a record for messing things up, so they might decide to get rid of us or to take over. And that's a scenario that does worry some people, whereas others say, no, not going to happen. We're far more than 50 years away from that kind of superintelligence, or we'll be able to control it. So I'm not really expert enough in that field to say whether I think that is a plausible scenario. But if there were artificial intelligence, and if it were actually conscious intelligence, which I think is important, that is, if it could have experiences, not just be a computer that can beat the best chess players or the best players at Go, which doesn't require consciousness, but actually had conscious awareness, then I would think that its experiences would matter as well. And so that's one reason why I phrase this as the survival of intelligent life on Earth, not as the survival of human life on Earth. Because it's possible that we could have non-human, highly intelligent beings who could have experiences, who could have rich and fulfilling lives with subjective experiences and perhaps even emotions in the way we do. And I wouldn't see that as a bad thing. I wouldn't think that we somehow have to preserve our species as such. What I think matters is that there are beings living good lives, whether they're human or not. But just want to add one more thing. There is, of course, a danger of social problems with the kind of artificial intelligence that we're creating now, which is not conscious beings, but is going to replace a lot of jobs. Not just low-level labouring jobs, but quite a lot of other jobs in the financial industry, for example, that artificial intelligence is going to be able to do better than humans. So, do we have the social structure in place that is going to be able to use the extra productivity of artificial intelligence to guarantee everybody a basically decent life? For example, a universal basic income. At the moment, we don't, and I think there is a worry that we, as has happened before, the technology will get ahead of the social concern, and we'll end up with a situation in which artificial intelligence makes us more productive, but makes a lot of people worse off than they are.
Does anyone have any final questions for Peter? There is just one question here. Yep.
Was that a question? Sorry.
Okay, well, if there aren't any final questions, I think we will have to wrap it up. I just wanted to... There is a question
there's one over there, I think,
seeing
yeah.
lots of hands. Thank you.
Yeah.
I came in super late this afternoon, but what's your opinion on life after death?
I don't believe there is such a thing.
You don't believe?
No.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Short question, short answer. You want to take
how
one more?
How good's that? That's how a festival's supposed to go, so how good's that?
The last question we had, last time Peter was with us at the School of Life, the final question when we had about 30 seconds remaining was, Peter, could you explain just briefly to us what consciousness actually is?
So your question was a lot easier than that. Thank you.
So with that, a huge thank you to Peter Singer for joining us this afternoon.